Let me bring in former Federal Labor Foreign Minister and former Premier of New South Wales, Bob Carr, joins me from the Sydney CBD. Thanks for joining me, Bob. I take it you support this 2050 net zero emissions target. It's been talked about a lot. A lot of countries and states have adopted it. How will Australia get to it?
Because business is doing it. Business is on this path, and business wants it to happen. Leave aside all the political arguments, leave aside my labour associations and record, Chris. I've spent the last week, because I am Professor of Climate and Business at the University of Technology, Sydney, talking to business. And the surge of investment in renewables, the fact that the Business Council of Australia, under the leadership of Jennifer Westacott, is saying business needs this target to pull in investment from overseas, because I know they'd be assured the Australian government is serious about this direction for the economy. All these arguments are pushing in this direction. You focus on the cost, but consumers are taking these choices anyway. The shift to electric vehicles, I think there was a threefold increase in demand in the last year.
0.6%. 0.6% of new sales were electric vehicles.
There's a big boost, I remember seeing those headlines. I saw the
headline. It was in the Nine media headlines, but the big boost they talked about was from like 0.4 to 0.6.
And Chris, Boris Johnson says there won't be any other vehicles on sale in the UK in 2035. This is a global trend, and it's happening, and Conservatives and businesses are embracing it. Look, the Business Council of Australia has endorsed this target by 2050, net zero emissions. And they say that business is so focused on making this happen, we're going to maximise investment in this country, for example, from overseas. The people who want to invest, for example, in carbon capture and storage, in solar, in big wind farms, in hydrogen, this exciting new area of wealth generation, are looking for the Australian government to lay down this target so they see Australia as a jurisdiction that wants this wave of new investment.
Well, if this is all happening, Bob Carr, if this is all happening and it's so rosy, we don't need any policies, presumably?
Well, we don't need the policies we were focused on 10 years ago. Here's one observation. We've gone beyond, in short, we've gone beyond emissions trading. Here's one observation. Labor was hammered in the last election, only a little over a year ago, for setting this target of a 45% cut in emissions by 2030. You remember the campaign?
Absolutely.
I spoke to one economist months ago who said, forget the fuss about that. Australia, because of the surge of investment in solar and wind, is on target to get there as a result of private sector investment decisions. Chris, don't hold out against it.
Bob Carr,
this is a pro-business argument.
Bob Carr, if it just happens, who cares? Who's going to stand in the way? Certainly not me, but the point is about government policies being driven to do this. Now, when you talk about the surge of investment in renewable energy, that's driven by the renewable energy target, and that's going to be built out this year. Don't you expect that surge of investment just to disappear when there's no longer a government subsidy for that renewable energy?
No, I don't, because the plunging price of renewables is now irreversible, and because you're operating with a world environment where there is a flow of money behind renewables. This thing is no one's proposing, apart from Barnaby Joyce, no one's proposing that we subsidise coal-fired power. Simply as a result of private sector investment decisions, you're going to see the closure of old coal-fired power stations, and not even Stalinist intervention policies are going to render them viable. This shift is upon us.
The trouble is, what we've seen so far is a lack of stability as additional renewables have come in. I noticed when South Australia was isolated from the national grid over the first 2 weeks of this month, that their use of gas-fired energy went up to well over 60%, almost 2/3 of their energy. They couldn't get anywhere near half of their energy from wind supplies. I noticed that in Germany, where they've got a big renewable push, where they're perhaps almost equivalent to South Australia, that they've run short of electricity lately. Their electricity is even more expensive than Australia's. So there are massive problems to overcome to keep prices down and supplies secure.
But Chris, this is a debate where both sides of politics ought to be focused, and I welcome Anthony Albanese's statement because it's getting us there, and I welcome recent statements by the Prime Minister which have focused, this is the key thing, on the grid and on storage. You've got all this investment in renewables. The thing is to speed that clean green power to the consumers. We've got an old-fashioned grid that was built around getting power from coal-fired power stations standing in the Hunter Valley and in the Latrobe Valley like Norman castles. But now we've got a more diffused energy generation sector. The thing is to render the grid more flexible and more resilient.
Which costs an enormous amount, and so does storage. Storage is incredibly expensive, and even when they cost renewable energy, they tend to only factor in 2 hours to 6 hours storage. Two key questions of this. If Australia were to get to zero net emissions by 2050, what's your best guess estimate of how much it would cost the economy?
Well, consumers and business are making this choice because it's more profitable. They're making the choice. This is a private sector choice.
No, we have high electricity prices as it is. We all accept our power prices are too high now, and they've been driven up by these policies, so we have no choice there.
No, they've been driven up by investment policies, perhaps over-investment in some areas, designed to upgrade a traditional power situation. You can't, Chris, you can't hold out against the fact that the private sector is, one, asking for governments to lay down a net zero emission policy by 2050.
Bob Carr, you've been around politics long enough to know that privates, big companies will line up for government subsidies every day of the week. And that's what they've got in this sector so far. I want to see them invest without subsidies.
Chris, enough of this old-fashioned climate change denialism, scepticism and resistance. The change
Come on,
is upon us.
We're talking about policy here, Bob. See, this is the debate becomes pretty silly when it's, denial versus reality. You know that I've never denied the science of climate change, but what I'm arguing here is about the reality of policy choices.
The consumers are changing and business is changing. Business investment decisions are going to drive this change. What every coalition state government in Australia is saying, what Boris Johnson is saying, what the Business Council of Australia is saying, and I reckon now after the mega fire crisis we've been through, every boardroom in Australia is no longer resisting but encouraging, is give us this target and we will get there.
And we will always have summer bushfires, as you know, as bad and as worse than this year.
No. Don't give me that nonsense. Chris, this was a mega fire. It was well beyond the range of normal. And people have been predicting, our best scientists have been predicting from 1988 that higher temperatures bring more serious fires.
They've been predicting that.
More serious fires.
They have been predicting that indeed, Bob Carr, but you have to face the fact that mega fire is just a made-up word. These are the worst fires New South Wales seen on record, as far as I can tell, but of course we've seen far worse bushfires previously in this country, going back to the previous century and before that. It's just the facts.
Chris,
the facts on all the data.
Chris, I believe the people who've been in the front line putting the lives of their fellow volunteers at risk, putting lives of great volunteer armies.
I believe the facts and data.
Our fire chiefs are saying this is way beyond normal. This is a longer fire season, more savage fires as a result of the measurable increase in average temperatures on the Australian land.
I'm just talking about
the fire chiefs.
I'm just talking about the facts and the data, because they don't spin a line. Let's just move on quickly, because we could talk about that for another hour. Just briefly, I have to ask you about what we've been seeing unfolding in court this week with your former New South Wales Labor colleagues over the Ian McDonald trial. It appears that your former colleague Eddie OBEID, an almost invisible character in those days, was running the New South Wales Labor government.
Well, certainly why I sacked him from Cabinet. I sacked him from the Cabinet. He wasn't running it when he was 4 years.
But didn't you appoint him to Cabinet in the first place?
No, he got elected by a caucus, in a caucus ballot. Whether we like it or not, Chris, he exercised this power. He had rich associations, I've got to say, with our present ambassador to Washington. He's in business in the Australian Water Company with then Senator Arthur Sinodinos, who was chairman of the OBEID company, the company that employed the OBEID sons. So let's not try to run an argument that now has been resolved by ICAC and is in the courts.
No, I'm just asking you about the power he had, and it seems extraordinary. It seems extraordinary that he had so much power. And I'm wondering whether...
Chris, my views are absolutely on the record. I've got a chapter about it in my book called Run for Your Life. I think you'll find it highly enlightening. It spells out my attitudes towards this cancer in the Australian Labor Party that he represented.
I understand that, and we've discussed it before. But I'm raising it because it's been...
in the courts.
Sure, that's why I'm raising it again.
Where it belongs to be.
Sure.
Where it belongs to be, and let's see how it goes before this judge. I understand in this case there's no jury, but let's see how the evidence goes before a judge, and I've got a lot of confidence in the judicial process.
Now, given that background and given what you've said about this in the past and what we're seeing brought out, and Anthony Albanese, no less than the federal Labor leader, dragged into this as a witness, does this sort of operation sully his reputation, the fact that he's sitting around with someone like Ian McDonald deciding his sort of factional future?
Not remotely. I don't think anyone has ever suggested that. You've had an ICAC inquiry into this matter. Anthony Albanese wasn't summoned before it. But when there's an inquiry into the one aspect of OBEID's performance, I think you had Arthur Sinodinos called to account for collaborating with OBEID, a Liberal senator, an advisor to John Howard, who was in company, this Australian Water Holdings. He was the chair of the OBEID front company, the company that employed OBEID's two sons. So you ought to have something to say about that. I think that's an interesting area to explore. Indeed.
I've asked Arthur Sinodinos about it. I'll ask you about Labor and him about Liberal. I appreciate your time again, Bob Carr. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Chris. Thank you.
Bob Carr there, the former Premier of New South Wales, former Foreign Minister of this fine country. He says 2050, net zero by then. Easy peasy. Everybody's on track. We'll see.